On to our final panelist, I'd like to introduce you all to Luke Potter, the Director of Cybersecurity at SureCloud. Luke.
Hello, everyone, and first and foremost, thank you very much to Shiv and Danny and the wider CyberDuck team for inviting SureCloud along to speak with you all this afternoon. So I'm the cybersecurity director at SureCloud. We partner with CyberDuck for mainly in the sort of risk and cyber compliance cybersecurity spaces. So I actually run the cyber division here at SureCloud. So we deliver penetration tests and vulnerability assessments to CyberDuck's clients and also our wider client base as well, which I'll talk more around later. So who are SureCloud? As I mentioned, we have a sort of risk advisory and a cybersecurity practice. We also have a large software side to our business, focusing very much in the GRC or governance, risk and compliance sector. So we provide applications to help organizations manage what would traditionally be spreadsheet driven compliance processes for varying levels of spreadsheet processes, things like 27001 compliance or GDPR, etc. So this element of the session is very much focused around security. It's my passion as well as my job, and we test numerous websites every year, and a number of those are on Drupal and other CMS platforms. And I guess security is at the forefront of all of our minds. Especially at the moment, all of our security strategies have had to change very rapidly over the past few months, not least because of the COVID pandemic. But obviously, enabling that remote workforce has had to change the mindset. And security should be at the forefront of every business decision we make, including something as critical to our organization as upgrading a core core platform such as Drupal or other sort of core service that we have. So clearly, as mentioned and as articulated by the other speakers, support for Drupal 7 has been extended through to November 2020. But support for Drupal 8 still ends in November 2021. Now, like everything, we should keep things patched and up to date, and that includes Drupal as much as anything. The laptop in front of you has more than likely had a patch released of it today. You're probably using Zoom or YouTube. Your web browser may have been patched very recently. Your TV, your smart TV, has more than likely popped up in the past few weeks saying you need to apply a patch or an update. And like everything, one of the best security defenses you can have is to keep your environments, and in this scenario, Drupal, taking advantage of the latest security features and options. I mean, looking at Drupal 9, it's a much smaller code base than Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 or below. And a lot of the older sort of legacy code has been removed or depreciated code. So in terms of the security community looking at Drupal 9, it's getting a lot of attention, which is a good thing. As mentioned by Tim and the other speakers, it's open source and the security community is all over it. And there are patches and updates all of the time. So going forward, let alone the features and the functionality to assure that security picture and plan going forward, Drupal 9 is a sensible move with that sort of security focus on. So, very much make upgrading to Drupal 9 a priority. Start now, but believe it or not, we do still see when we're testing for clients, running our penetration testing projects for our customer base, Drupal 6 and below as well. So if you are listening, watching, live or on the sort of on demand, and you are using Drupal 6, if anything that you do this week, start getting your plans in place to migrate to a newer supported version. Next slide, please. So clearly you're going through a process of evaluating and looking with a provider. You need to have security considerations as part of that. So when you're choosing a provider to work with, look at their experience, clearly how experienced they are in working in terms of Drupal in a whole, but from a security perspective, how do they train their developers? Do their teams have best practice knowledge around security best practice in Drupal, things like secure coding practices? Do they take advantage of things like the Open Web Application Security Project and the best practice secure coding guidelines they offer? When we run penetration tests, we use as part of our methodology the OWASP testing guides, for example, but there are fantastic resources out there for development houses to use as part of their own best practices. But bear that as part of your consideration. But also when running the migration process itself, often there's a lot of access to lots of sensitive information. Depending on the complexity of the migration, there may be data moving around between locations, maybe moving around between developers, maybe moving around in terms of hosting environments. Bear in mind when you're looking at this process, the security controls that fit around that wider kind of mechanism. So also what's happening to the data that they've had access to post-migration, where's it being stored? How are any test environments or trial environments decommissioned afterwards? Making sure that in testing environments, no production data is used, for example, or if it is used in any way, it's fully sanitized and anonymized as appropriate. Next slide, please. Thank you. So once you've completed your migration and you've gone through, you're now live and you're in a situation where you're sort of in a more business as usual state and you're looking forward to Drupal 10 or whatever comes next, think about defining, if you haven't already done so, the security responsibilities. So, where do the responsibilities of the security of your Drupal sites or implementation lie? So, for example, you may be responsible for functional testing changes, but your development house may be responsible for keeping Drupal up to date going forward. Think about the approach you have in terms of your business, in terms of wider responsibilities, in terms of the hosting providers and where the responsibilities lie there. But most importantly, one of the best things you can do is deliver or have delivered a penetration test. So this is where a security company such as SureCloud will run a simulated sort of cyber attack against your Drupal environment or your website, with a real focus on looking for points of compromise, vulnerabilities. So we will use the same tools, techniques, methodologies as a genuine attacker would do, but we're on the right side of this. We're working in collaboration with you to improve and develop the security posture of your implementation. Just to share a bit of best practice guidance, I guess, on this call, is that we often find some very, very common weaknesses that you can take away from today and look at your implementations to make sure that you're not vulnerable to these. For example, one of the most common things we find is administrative interfaces being accessible over the internet. Clearly, they may well be protected by credentials, username and password, but often they don't have two-factor authentication enables. So in that scenario, one of the best practice advices we would say is make sure your administrative interfaces are restricted to only be accessible from locations that you trust, for example, your corporate VPN or corporate network, but also make sure that you're implementing two-factor authentication on every account, not just some accounts, every single account on that site. Wider hardening that we often see as missing is best practice web server configurations. So that will be web server best practice headers, as we call them, or HTTPS, or to not get too technical, but SSL and TLS configurations. Again, very, very common weaknesses that are easy to remediate and address. And even today, or over the coming weeks, harden your implementations that you have today or going forward. What you can also do is, regular vulnerability assessments. So this is sort of maybe automated scanning or assessments being run on a more regular basis against the site as a sort of low-hanging fruit. You may run an assessment every month to identify common vulnerabilities and then a full manual test every year. As we've mentioned, patching core and plugins or modules is absolutely key. I mean, just last week, 18th of June, the US government issued a notice to critical vulnerabilities in Drupal, which were patched by the great community that found them. The Drupal security team were very, very quick in their response and remediation and releasing of a patch, as we see evidently in every single scenario. But the point is, just last week, 2 criticals highlights that the need to keep your environments up to date. And the fact that things are being found and are being patched is brilliant. That's what it's all about. That's what we're all here to do to improve the security posture of our systems and services. And then the final point is look at things like web application firewalls and content delivery networks. So, web application firewalls will often have Drupal components in them, which will block common attacks. And if there's an attack live going out, maybe a 0-day vulnerability or something that is not known about yet, often clearly the Drupal team will be all over it, but the web application firewall suppliers or vendors will often look to release a rule to block those attacks very, very quickly. So it's just a defense in-depth approach. And then content delivery networks, there are numerous ones out there, the likes of Cloudflare or CloudFront, etc. Amazon Cloud's offerings as well can help to distribute and help you to scale very, very quickly, but also mitigate the risks of distributed denial of services attacks, which you've probably heard about against your websites as well. Okay. And then finally, what I always like to do on these sessions is just highlight sort of wider attacks to consider outside of just going on in the industry at the moment and we're seeing. So with the COVID situation, we've seen a massive uptick in social engineering attacks. Phishing, you probably all heard of. You probably had a load of phishing emails today, very, very common. But you may not have heard of vishing, which is voice-based phishing, and smishing, which is SMS-based phishing attacks. So a lot of people don't actually realize that it's very, very simple to call you from any number that I wanted to. I could call you now from your best friend or from NHS Track and Trace or from anyone I wanted to just by spoofing the outbound number. I could also send you a text message from anyone I wanted to as well. Now, we use those techniques to demonstrate that to customers, but actually we did a piece with the BBC very, very recently demonstrating those risks. It was on the One Show a couple of weeks back. But in terms of bringing this back to the Drupal environment, be very wary of someone calling you, posing to be from your supplier or IT support company, trying to extract information from you that they may use to then compromise your website. The number that appears isn't necessarily the number they're calling from. It's called caller line ID spoofing. It's very simple to do. What we see a lot of is website cloning attacks as well, to then be used in the phishing or smishing examples. So a lot of companies will be targeted where the attack group or the attackers will register a website domain very similar to that being used for that real company. So say you're company A and your website is companyaa.com, they'll register company-a.com, clone your website, and then send you an email or a phishing message to target you very specifically, to draw you to their phishing page, to then extract information to then compromise your real website. So bear that in mind, and lots of guidance out there on the internet around that as well, on the SureCloud website. Physical attacks to consider. So where is the data? Making sure that the data is in an environment that you have done your due diligence on. And that leads me nicely into the final point, which is make sure that you've considered attacks and are doing your due diligence against suppliers. Thank you very much, Shiv, and the wider CyberDuck team.